the first American soldier to capture an 8-year-old German boy carrying a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket, thought he was hallucinating. Staff Sergeant William Morrison of the 94th Infantry Division had been fighting across Europe for 11 months. But nothing had prepared him for what he encountered in the rubble-strewn streets of Frankenthal on March 23, 1945. The child stood barely 4 feet tall, his oversized Wehrmacht uniform hanging like a tent around his skeletal frame, but his eyes held the cold determination of a seasoned killer. Morrison later wrote to his wife in Ohio, "I've seen grown men break under artillery fire, but this kid just stared at me like he was deciding whether to surrender or blow us both to hell. When I took that Panzerfaust from his hands, it weighed almost as much as he did. The damn thing was loaded and ready to fire." What Morrison had discovered was not an isolated case of a lost child playing soldier. He had encountered the leading edge of Nazi Germany's most desperate military experiment, the systematic transformation of an entire generation of children into front-line combat troops. By spring 1945, American forces were capturing German child soldiers on a daily basis, some as young as 8 years old, armed with weapons that could destroy Sherman tanks and trained with a fanatical dedication that shocked hardened combat veterans. The scale of this phenomenon would not become clear until after the war, when Allied intelligence officers compiled their reports. The Hitler Youth, which had begun in 1926 as a political organization for boys aged 14 to 18, had evolved into a military machine encompassing 8.8 million children at the war's outbreak. By 1945, the Volkssturm Home Guard was routinely drafting 12-year-old Hitler Youth members into combat units, while defense-strengthening camps trained boys as young as 10 in the use of infantry weapons, hand grenades, and anti-tank rockets. The American discovery of German child soldiers began long before the final collapse of the Third Reich. As early as June 1944, during the Battle of Normandy, soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division encountered members of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, an entire armored division composed primarily of 16 and 17-year-old boys from Hitler Youth units. In the 1st Battalion of this division, 65% of the soldiers were under 18 years old, and only 3% were over 25. Captain Robert Hayes, a company commander in the 16th Infantry Regiment, recorded his first encounter with these child soldiers in his after-action report. "We attacked Hill 117 at 0600 hours and immediately came under intense machine gun and anti-tank fire. When we finally overran their positions at 1430, we discovered that most of the German defenders were teenagers. The youngest prisoner we took was 15 years old, but he had been operating an MG-42 machine gun with the skill of a veteran. These weren't kids playing war, they were trained killers who fought to the death." The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend would suffer 60% casualties during the Battle of Normandy, with most of the dead and wounded being teenagers. American medics treating wounded German prisoners were stunned by the youth of their patients. Corpsman James Mitchell of the 4th Infantry Division wrote, "I treated a German kid who couldn't have been more than 16. He had shrapnel wounds in his chest and was asking for his mother. But when I tried to help him, he still tried to pull the pin on a grenade. Even dying, these kids were dangerous." The systematic militarization of German children had begun years before these battlefield encounters. In 1937, the Hitler Youth established its first rifle school, partially at the urging of General Erwin Rommel, who toured Hitler Youth meetings and lectured on German soldiering. By 1938, 1.5 million Hitler Youth members were being trained to shoot rifles, and 51,500 boys had earned their Hitler Youth Marksmanship Medal before the year's end. Technical Sergeant Frank Kowalski, an intelligence specialist with the First Army, spent months after the war interviewing captured Hitler Youth leaders and reconstructing their training programs. His reports, classified until 1978, revealed the sophisticated nature of German child soldier preparation. "They weren't just handing rifles to kids," Kowalski wrote. "This was a systematic program that started with boys as young as 6 in the Children of the She-Wolf program, moved them into the German young folk at 10, then into the Hitler Youth proper at 14. By the time they reached 16, these kids had been receiving military training for 10 years. The escalation of child soldier deployment accelerated dramatically after Germany's defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943. As German casualties mounted, the Hitler Youth was officially called to arms, with older teenagers being recruited into regular Wehrmacht and SS units, while younger children took over increasingly important home defense roles. By 1944, boys as young as 14 were operating 88mm anti-aircraft guns in defense of German cities, often working alongside girls of similar ages. Lieutenant Colonel David Richardson, commanding officer of the 358th Fighter Group, encountered these child anti-aircraft crews during bombing missions over Germany in late 1944. "We'd be making our bombing runs over industrial targets, and the flak would be coming up as thick as ever," Richardson recalled in a post-war interview. "When we finally occupied those positions, we'd find gun crews that looked like they should have been in high school, not manning heavy artillery. Some of those kids couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds soaking wet, but they were putting up a hell of a fight." The physical transformation of German children under military training shocked American observers. Major Harold Phillips, an Army medical officer who examined captured Hitler Youth members, noted dramatic changes in their physical development. These children had been subjected to an intensive physical conditioning program that began at age 6, Phillips reported. Boys who should have been playing games were instead performing military exercises for hours each day. Their muscle development was abnormal for their age groups, but so was their psychological conditioning. They showed classic signs of indoctrination: complete obedience to authority, inability to question orders, and a willingness to die for their cause that I've only seen in fanatical adult soldiers. The industrial scale of German child soldier production became apparent to American forces as they advanced into Germany proper in early 1945. Master Sergeant Anthony Ricci, a quartermaster specialist, was assigned to catalog captured German military supplies and was astounded by what he found. "Entire warehouses were filled with uniforms sized for children," Ricci reported. "We found thousands of small-sized steel helmets, miniature mess kits, and weapons modified for use by kids." The Germans had essentially created an entire military-industrial complex dedicated to equipping child soldiers. The weapons modifications discovered by American forces revealed the extent of German planning for child warfare. Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, originally designed for adult soldiers, had been simplified and lightened for use by children as young as 12. The standard Panzerfaust 60 weighed 7.7 pounds when loaded, but the modified versions found in Hitler Youth arsenals weighed only 5.2 pounds and featured shortened barrels and simplified sighting systems. Staff Sergeant Robert Chun, an ordnance specialist with the 3rd Armored Division, examined hundreds of these modified weapons. "The Germans had thought of everything," Chun noted. "They reduced the weight of the Panzerfaust by using thinner steel and aluminum components, but they maintained the same penetration capability enough to punch through 4.7 inches of armor at 165 yards. A 12-year-old kid with one of these could knock out a Sherman tank." The effectiveness of German child soldiers in combat continued to shock American commanders throughout the final months of the war. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend played a crucial role in the initial German offensive. Major General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, encountered these young soldiers during the fighting around Bastogne. "We were taking heavy casualties from what we initially thought were seasoned SS troops," Gavin later wrote. "When we finally captured some of their positions, we found that many of the defenders were teenagers who had been fighting with a ferocity that exceeded anything we'd seen from adult soldiers. These kids had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they preferred death to surrender. It was both admirable and terrifying." The indoctrination process that created such dedicated child soldiers was documented in detail by Captain Margaret Sullivan, one of the first American intelligence officers to interrogate captured Hitler Youth leaders. Her interviews, conducted in prisoner of war camps in spring 1945, revealed a systematic program of psychological conditioning that began in early childhood. The Hitler Youth program was essentially a 12-year process of military indoctrination, Sullivan reported. Children as young as 6 were taught that their highest purpose was to serve the fatherland through military service. By age 10, they were participating in war games with real weapons. By 14, they were receiving formal military training that was identical to what adult soldiers received. By 16, they were psychologically and physically prepared to die for Nazi Germany. The dedication of German child soldiers to their cause was demonstrated most dramatically during the final Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945. As Soviet forces encircled the German capital, the city's defense included multiple Hitler Youth battalions, some with average ages as low as 14 years old. When American forces linked up with Soviet troops after the city's fall, they discovered evidence of desperate child soldier resistance that had continued until the final hours of the war. Colonel William Stevens, an intelligence officer with the First Army, interviewed Soviet commanders who had fought against these child defenders. The Russians told us that the Hitler Youth units were among the most fanatical fighters they encountered in the entire war, Stevens reported. These kids would hide in ruins with Panzerfausts and attack Soviet tanks at point-blank range, knowing they would be killed immediately afterward. The Soviets estimated that child soldiers accounted for 30% of their tank losses during the street fighting in Berlin. The psychological impact of encountering German child soldiers profoundly affected American troops throughout the war. Sergeant First Class Michael Romano, a combat engineer with the 4th Armored Division, struggled with the moral implications of fighting against children. How do you shoot at a kid who's trying to kill you? Romano asked in a letter to his chaplain. These weren't innocent children caught in the crossfire, they were trained soldiers who would kill you without hesitation. But they were still kids, and seeing them dead on the battlefield was harder than anything else we experienced in the war. The systematic nature of German child soldier training was further revealed through the capture of Hitler Youth training facilities throughout Germany. Camp Vogelsang, a massive Hitler Youth leadership school in the Eifel region, was occupied by American forces in February 1945. The facility, which could house 1,500 trainees, contained extensive military training areas including rifle ranges, obstacle courses, and simulated battlefield environments specifically designed for children. Captain Thomas Murphy, who led the team that catalogued the Vogelsang facilities, was struck by the sophistication of the training program. This wasn't a summer camp, Murphy reported. This was a military academy for children. The dormitories were arranged like army barracks, the daily schedule was identical to basic training, and the curriculum included advanced subjects like small unit tactics, weapons maintenance, and battlefield first aid. These kids were receiving military education that was more comprehensive than what many American soldiers got in basic training. The academic integration of military training into German education shocked American educators who examined captured school records. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an education specialist with the Office of Strategic Services, analyzed curricula from dozens of German schools and found that military subjects had completely replaced traditional academic subjects by 1944. Mathematics classes were focused on calculating artillery trajectories and ammunition consumption rates, Dr. Mitchell reported. Geography lessons centered on identifying strategic targets and understanding battlefield terrain. History classes were devoted entirely to German military victories and the supposed racial superiority of the German people. Literature classes studied only military texts and Nazi propaganda. These children were receiving no real education, they were being programmed to be soldiers from the moment they entered school. The physical conditioning of German children for military service began at an early age and intensified as they grew older. Lieutenant Robert Park, a physical training instructor who analyzed captured Hitler Youth fitness programs, was amazed by their intensity and comprehensiveness. American kids their age were playing baseball and going to the movies, Park noted. German kids were running obstacle courses with full packs, practicing bayonet drills, and learning to throw live grenades. The average 14-year-old Hitler Youth member was in better physical condition than most American soldiers. The weapons training provided to German children was both extensive and sophisticated. Technical training manuals captured by American forces revealed that Hitler Youth members received instruction on over 20 different weapon systems, including rifles, machine guns, anti-tank rockets, and explosives. Sergeant Major Frank Williams, an armorer with the 5th Infantry Division, examined hundreds of these training manuals and was impressed by their technical detail. These manuals were as comprehensive as anything we used to train adult soldiers, Williams reported. The sections on the Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket included detailed explanations of armor penetration characteristics, optimal firing angles, and target identification. Kids were learning ballistics and metallurgy alongside basic weapons handling. They weren't just taught to shoot, they were taught to understand their weapons at an engineering level. The medical conditioning of German child soldiers was equally systematic. American Army doctors examining captured Hitler youth discovered that the children had been subjected to extensive medical screening and conditioning programs designed to maximize their combat effectiveness. Major Patricia Jones, an Army nurse who treated wounded German children, documented numerous examples of medical experimentation. These children had been given dietary supplements to enhance their physical development, Major Jones reported. They had been subjected to psychological conditioning techniques designed to eliminate fear responses. Many showed signs of having received experimental medications to enhance alertness and reduce fatigue. The Germans had essentially turned these kids into laboratory subjects in their effort to create perfect soldiers. The industrial production system supporting German child soldiers was vast and sophisticated. American intelligence officers discovered that major German corporations had established entire production lines dedicated to manufacturing equipment for children. The Krupp Steel Works had produced over 200,000 small-sized steel helmets between 1942 and 1945, while the Mauser Weapons Factory had manufactured nearly 50,000 rifles with shortened stocks and modified triggers for use by children. Colonel Edward Thompson, an industrial intelligence specialist, spent 6 months after the war documenting German child soldier production systems. The scale was incredible, Thompson reported. Dozens of factories were producing specialized equipment for children-modified uniforms, smaller weapons, lighter equipment. The Germans had invested millions of Reichsmarks in creating an industrial infrastructure specifically designed to support child warfare. This wasn't an improvised last-minute measure, it was a long-term strategic program. The psychological conditioning techniques used on German children were particularly disturbing to American mental health professionals. Dr. James Harrison, an Army psychiatrist who examined captured Hitler Youth members, documented extensive evidence of systematic psychological manipulation designed to eliminate normal childhood emotional responses. These children had been conditioned to suppress empathy, fear, and independent thought, Dr. Harrison reported. They responded to authority with automatic obedience, showed no emotional reaction to violence or death, and were incapable of questioning orders regardless of how illogical or immoral those orders might be. The Germans had essentially created child psychopaths through systematic psychological conditioning. The role of German women in supporting child soldier programs shocked American investigators who had expected to find evidence of maternal resistance to the militarization of children. Instead, they discovered that German mothers had been systematically recruited to support and encourage their children's military service. Captain Linda Roberts, a Women's Army Corps officer who interviewed German mothers, found widespread acceptance of child militarization. These mothers weren't horrified by what was being done to their children, Roberts reported. They were proud of it. They had been conditioned to believe that military service was the highest honor their children could achieve, even if it meant certain death. Many mothers told me they would rather see their children die as soldiers than survive as civilians. The psychological conditioning extended to entire families. The recruitment techniques used to attract children to military service were sophisticated and comprehensive. American psychological warfare specialists analyzed captured German propaganda materials and found extensive evidence of systematic manipulation designed to appeal to children's psychological vulnerabilities. Major Carl Peterson, a propaganda analyst, documented hundreds of examples of child-targeted recruitment materials. The Germans understood child psychology better than we did, Peterson reported. They used comic books, movies, songs, and games to make military service seem exciting and heroic. They created an entire fictional universe where children were the heroes saving Germany from its enemies. Kids who might have been reading Superman comics in America were instead reading propaganda that convinced them that becoming soldiers was the greatest adventure possible. The educational background of German child soldiers revealed the systematic nature of their preparation. American intelligence officers analyzing captured personnel records found that most child soldiers had received extensive technical education in addition to military training. Private First Class David Lee, a clerk who processed thousands of captured German documents, was amazed by the breadth of technical knowledge possessed by child soldiers. These kids knew more about engineering and technology than most American college students, Lee reported. They had been trained in radio operation, mechanical repair, chemistry, and metallurgy. A 15-year-old Hitler Youth member could field strip an MG-42 machine gun, perform basic vehicle maintenance, operate sophisticated radio equipment, and calculate artillery firing solutions. They weren't just soldiers, they were technicians. The leadership structure within German child soldier units was based on a sophisticated hierarchy that gave significant authority to teenagers. American officers examining captured organizational charts found that 16- and 17-year-old Hitler Youth leaders commanded units of up to 500 younger children. The responsibility and authority given to these young leaders was unprecedented in military history. Captain Richard Brown, who interviewed captured Hitler Youth leaders, was struck by their maturity and competence. These teenagers were making tactical decisions that would challenge experienced adult officers, Brown reported. They were responsible for training younger children, planning operations, and maintaining discipline within their units. The German system had created teenage military leaders who were more capable than many adult American non-commissioned officers. The international implications of German child soldier deployment were significant and long-lasting. American State Department officials recognized that the systematic use of children in combat represented a fundamental violation of traditional military ethics and international law. Ambassador Charles Wilson, who served on the post-war commission investigating German war crimes, identified child soldier deployment as a unique form of war crime. The Germans had weaponized an entire generation of children, Wilson reported. They had transformed childhood itself into a military resource. This represented a new category of war crime that existing international law was not equipped to address. The systematic corruption of children for military purposes was as significant a crime against humanity as any other atrocity committed by the Nazi regime. The post-war fate of German child soldiers presented American occupation authorities with unprecedented challenges. Thousands of children who had been trained as soldiers needed to be demilitarized and reintegrated into civilian society, but many had never experienced normal childhood development. Major General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of occupied Germany, established special rehabilitation programs for former child soldiers. These children had been robbed of their childhood and turned into weapons, General Clay reported. Returning them to normal life required extensive psychological rehabilitation, educational remediation, and social support. Many had never attended normal schools, played children's games, or experienced family life outside the context of military service. We were essentially trying to reconstruct their childhood from scratch. The medical treatment of former German child soldiers revealed the extent of physical and psychological damage caused by their military service. American military hospitals established special wards for treating former child soldiers, many of whom suffered from malnutrition, physical injuries, and severe psychological trauma. Dr. Robert Anderson, Chief of Pediatric Medicine at the U.S. Army Hospital in Frankfurt, documented extensive health problems among former child soldiers. These children showed signs of premature physical development caused by excessive exercise and inadequate nutrition, Dr. Anderson reported. Many suffered from stress fractures, joint damage, and muscular injuries typically seen in adult athletes. Their psychological condition was even more concerning. They showed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and social dysfunction. The German military had literally worn out these children's bodies and minds before they reached adulthood. The educational rehabilitation of former German child soldiers required the complete reconstruction of their academic knowledge. American educators discovered that most child soldiers were functionally illiterate in subjects other than military technology and had received no instruction in critical thinking, creative expression, or independent analysis. Dr. Helen Carter, an educational specialist who designed rehabilitation curricula, found the challenge overwhelming. These children had been educated to be obedient soldiers, not thinking human beings, Dr. Carter reported. They could disassemble and reassemble complex weapons but couldn't read a simple storybook. They could calculate artillery trajectories but couldn't solve basic arithmetic problems. They had memorized Nazi propaganda but had never been taught to question or analyze information. We had to start their education from the beginning. The social reintegration of former German child soldiers was complicated by their continued loyalty to Nazi ideology and their difficulty forming normal relationships with peers and adults. American social workers documented numerous cases of former child soldiers who continued to exhibit military behavior patterns months or years after the war's end. Mary Johnson, a social worker who supervised rehabilitation programs, found that military conditioning was extremely difficult to reverse. These children continued to respond to civilian authority figures as if they were military commanders, Johnson reported. They had difficulty playing normal children's games, couldn't form friendships with children who hadn't been soldiers, and showed persistent aggressive behavior toward anyone they perceived as an enemy. Many had been so thoroughly conditioned to obey orders that they were incapable of making independent decisions about even simple matters like what to eat or when to sleep. The long-term psychological impact of child soldier service was documented through follow-up studies conducted by American researchers into the 1960s and 70s. Dr. William Foster, a psychiatrist who tracked the development of former German child soldiers over 20 years, found persistent mental health problems among the majority of his subjects. Even decades after the war, many former child soldiers continued to suffer from anxiety, depression, and social dysfunction, Dr. Foster reported. They had difficulty maintaining employment, forming romantic relationships, and functioning as parents. The military conditioning they had received as children had permanently altered their psychological development in ways that could never be fully reversed. They remained prisoners of their childhood military service for the rest of their lives. The impact of discovering German child soldiers on American military doctrine was significant and lasting. The systematic use of children in combat challenged traditional American assumptions about the nature of warfare and the protection of non-combatants. General Omar Bradley, commanding general of the 12th Army Group, ordered comprehensive studies of child soldier tactics and capabilities to inform future American military planning. The German use of child soldiers represented a fundamental change in the nature of warfare, General Bradley reported. We could no longer assume that children in combat zones were non-combatants requiring protection. We had to develop new rules of engagement, new identification procedures, and new psychological preparation for our troops who might face child soldiers in future conflicts. The Germans had weaponized childhood itself, and we needed to be prepared for that possibility in future wars. The technological innovations developed by Germans for child soldier use influenced post-war American weapons development. The simplified, lightweight versions of German weapons captured by American forces provided valuable insights for designing weapons suitable for smaller, lighter troops. Colonel James Wright, Chief of Small Arms Development at Aberdeen Proving Ground, studied hundreds of captured German child soldier weapons. The German modifications were brilliant from an engineering perspective, Colonel Wright reported. They had managed to maintain weapon effectiveness while reducing weight and complexity to levels suitable for children. Their simplified Panzerfaust design was particularly impressive. It retained full anti-tank capability while being light enough for a 12-year-old to carry and simple enough for a child to operate effectively. We incorporated many of their design innovations into our own lightweight weapons programs. The intelligence value of captured German child soldiers was initially underestimated by American interrogators who assumed that children would have little useful military information. However, experienced interrogators soon discovered that child soldiers often possessed detailed knowledge of German military capabilities, plans, and weaknesses. Captain Stephen Clark, a counterintelligence specialist, found that child soldiers were often more forthcoming with information than adult prisoners. These kids had been present during high-level military planning sessions because adults didn't consider them security risks, Clark reported. They had overheard conversations, seen documents, and observed activities that adult soldiers would never have been exposed to. Many had served as messengers, orderlies, and assistants to senior officers and had accumulated extensive intelligence information. Ironically, the youngest prisoners often provided the most valuable intelligence. The documentation of German child soldier programs by American forces created a comprehensive archive that would influence international humanitarian law for decades. The evidence collected by American investigators was instrumental in establishing legal precedents regarding the use of children in armed conflict. Colonel Patricia Williams, who supervised the documentation effort, recognized the historical significance of their work. "We were documenting crimes against children that had never been systematically recorded before," Colonel Williams reported. The German child soldier program represented a new form of war crime that needed to be preserved as evidence and studied to prevent future occurrences. "Our documentation efforts created the foundation for international laws protecting children in armed conflict that are still in effect today." The economic analysis of German child soldier programs revealed the massive resources that Nazi Germany had devoted to militarizing children. American economic specialists calculated that Germany had spent the equivalent of over $1 billion in modern currency on child soldier training, equipment, and support systems between 1933 and 1945. The scale of this investment demonstrated the strategic importance that Nazi leadership placed on child warfare. Major Robert Davis, an economic analyst who studied German military expenditures, was amazed by the scope of child soldier investment. The Germans had created an entire military-industrial complex dedicated to children, Davis reported. They had built thousands of training facilities, manufactured millions of pieces of specialized equipment, and employed hundreds of thousands of adults in support of child soldier programs. This represented one of the largest investments in child warfare in human history. The psychological profiles of German child soldier trainers revealed individuals who had been specifically selected and conditioned to transform children into soldiers without emotional attachment or moral qualms. American military psychologists interviewing captured trainers found evidence of systematic psychological conditioning that eliminated normal adult protective instincts toward children. Dr. Margaret Thompson, a military psychologist who studied child soldier trainers, found disturbing patterns of psychological manipulation. These adults had been conditioned to view children as military resources rather than human beings requiring protection, Dr. Thompson reported. They showed no emotional response to sending children into combat situations where death was certain. They had been psychologically conditioned to eliminate parental and protective instincts that would normally prevent adults from endangering children. The religious aspects of German child soldier conditioning included the systematic replacement of traditional Christian values with Nazi ideology that glorified warfare and death. American chaplains working with former child soldiers found that traditional religious concepts of morality, compassion, and peace had been completely eliminated from their worldview. Chaplain Robert Miller, who counseled hundreds of former child soldiers, documented the systematic destruction of religious faith. These children had been taught that dying in battle was the equivalent of religious salvation, Chaplain Miller reported. They believed that military service was a sacred duty that superseded all other moral obligations, including the commandment against killing. Traditional religious concepts of love, forgiveness, and peace had been replaced with a warrior cult that glorified violence and death. Restoring normal religious understanding required years of careful counseling and re-education. The role of German schools in supporting child soldier recruitment was comprehensive and systematic. American educators examining captured school records found that traditional academic subjects had been completely replaced with military and ideological training by 1944. Teachers had been required to identify students with military potential and recommend them for advanced training programs. Dr. John Peterson, an education specialist who analyzed German school systems, found extensive evidence of systematic militarization. German schools had become recruitment centers for child soldiers, Dr. Peterson reported. Teachers were required to evaluate students based on their military potential rather than their academic ability. Students who showed aptitude for warfare were removed from normal education and placed in specialized military training programs. The entire educational system had been transformed into a child soldier production mechanism. The geographic distribution of German child soldier programs revealed that rural areas had been more extensively militarized than urban centers. American intelligence officers mapping child soldier recruitment patterns found that small towns and farming communities had provided disproportionate numbers of child soldiers compared to major cities. This pattern reflected the systematic exploitation of traditional German rural values emphasizing obedience, physical strength, and military service. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Johnson, who analyzed recruitment patterns, found significant regional variations. Rural German children were more susceptible to military recruitment because their communities had stronger traditions of military service and obedience to authority, Johnson reported. Urban children were more likely to question military ideology and resist recruitment efforts. The Germans had specifically targeted rural communities for intensive child soldier recruitment because they provided more compliant and dedicated recruits. The technological sophistication of German child soldier equipment was remarkable considering the resource constraints facing Germany in the final years of the war. American engineers examining captured equipment found evidence of advanced metallurgy, ergonomic design, and manufacturing techniques specifically adapted for child users. The Germans had invested significant research and development resources in creating weapons optimized for children. Technical Sergeant Paul Anderson, an engineer who analyzed captured equipment, was impressed by the sophistication of the designs. The Germans had created an entire family of weapons specifically designed for children, Anderson reported. These weren't just smaller versions of adult weapons, they were completely re-engineered systems that took into account the physical and cognitive limitations of child users. The level of engineering sophistication was remarkable considering that Germany was supposedly short of resources in the final years of the war. The communication systems used by German child soldier units were advanced and sophisticated, incorporating the latest radio technology and encryption techniques. American signal intelligence specialists found that child soldiers had been trained to use complex communication equipment and had been given access to high-level military communications networks. This level of technical responsibility was unprecedented for child personnel. Captain Susan Davis, a communications specialist who analyzed captured German radio equipment, found evidence of advanced training programs. These children were operating radio equipment that many adult American soldiers couldn't use effectively, Davis reported. They had been trained in complex encryption procedures, frequency management, and network protocols. The Germans had given children access to sensitive communication systems that would have been restricted to senior personnel in most armies. The medical support systems for German child soldiers were comprehensive and sophisticated, including specialized field hospitals, pediatric medical personnel, and medical equipment designed specifically for treating wounded children. American medical officers found evidence of extensive medical planning specifically focused on child soldier casualties. Major Patricia Clark, an Army medical officer who examined captured German medical facilities, found sophisticated pediatric military medicine programs. The Germans had developed an entire medical specialty focused on treating wounded child soldiers, Clark reported. They had specialized equipment, trained personnel, and treatment protocols specifically designed for children injured in combat. This represented a level of medical planning that indicated they expected significant child soldier casualties and were prepared to treat them as routine military wounded rather than as exceptional cases requiring special protection. The logistics systems supporting German child soldier units were complex and extensive, including specialized supply chains, transportation networks, and support personnel. American logistics specialists found that Germany had created an entire military support infrastructure specifically designed to maintain child soldier units in combat. Colonel David Wilson, a logistics specialist who studied German supply systems, was amazed by their comprehensiveness. The Germans had created specialized supply chains for everything from child-sized uniforms to modified rations designed for growing children, Wilson reported. They had transportation systems specifically designed to move child soldier units, maintenance programs for child-operated equipment, and support personnel trained to work with child soldiers. This represented a massive logistical undertaking that required significant resources and planning. The international recruitment of child soldiers by Germany included efforts to recruit children from occupied territories and allied nations. American intelligence officers found evidence that Germany had attempted to establish child soldier programs in occupied France, Poland, and other conquered territories. These international recruitment efforts represented an attempt to create a Europe-wide system of child warfare. Major Linda Thompson, an intelligence specialist who studied German recruitment efforts, found extensive documentation of international programs. The Germans weren't content to militarize only German children, Thompson reported. They had active programs to recruit children from occupied territories and were training foreign children alongside German youth. They were attempting to create an international army of child soldiers that would serve German military objectives throughout occupied Europe, The resistance to German child soldier programs by some German adults was documented but limited in scope and effectiveness. American investigators found evidence of isolated attempts by teachers, parents, and religious leaders to protect children from military recruitment, but these efforts were largely unsuccessful due to the comprehensive nature of Nazi control systems. Captain Robert Johnson, who investigated resistance to child soldier programs, found limited but significant evidence of opposition. Some German adults attempted to protect children from military service, but they faced severe punishment including imprisonment and execution, Johnson reported. Teachers who refused to identify students for military recruitment were removed from their positions. Parents who attempted to hide their children from recruitment were arrested. Religious leaders who spoke against child militarization were sent to concentration camps. The Nazi system was designed to eliminate any opposition to child soldier recruitment. The post-war prosecution of individuals responsible for German child soldier programs faced significant legal and practical challenges. American military prosecutors found that existing international law provided limited guidance for prosecuting crimes against children in military contexts. The systematic use of children as soldiers represented a new category of war crime that required new legal frameworks. Colonel James Wilson, a military prosecutor who worked on war crimes cases, faced unprecedented legal challenges. The systematic use of children as soldiers was clearly a crime against humanity, but existing law provided limited guidance for prosecution, Wilson reported. We had to develop new legal theories and precedents while working with limited evidence and witnesses. Many of the individuals responsible for child soldier programs had been killed in the war or had destroyed evidence before surrender. Achieving justice for these crimes against children proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of post-war legal proceedings. The influence of German child soldier programs on American military training was significant and lasting. The effectiveness of German child soldiers in combat forced American military leaders to reconsider their assumptions about age, training, and military effectiveness. The German experience demonstrated that intensive training could create effective soldiers regardless of age, challenging traditional military personnel policies. General George Patton, one of America's most experienced combat commanders, was profoundly influenced by his encounters with German child soldiers. The Germans proved that age is less important than training and motivation in creating effective soldiers, Patton wrote in his post-war memoirs. Their child soldiers were often more effective than adult troops who had received less intensive training. This forced us to reconsider our assumptions about military personnel and training methods. The propaganda value of German child soldiers for Nazi ideology was significant and carefully calculated. American psychological warfare specialists found extensive evidence that child soldier programs had been designed as much for propaganda purposes as for military effectiveness. The image of children willing to die for Nazi Germany was intended to demonstrate the total commitment of the German people to their cause. Major Karl Peterson, a propaganda analyst who studied German psychological warfare techniques, found sophisticated propaganda strategies. The Germans used child soldiers as propaganda symbols to demonstrate that every German was committed to fighting to the death, Peterson reported. Images of young children in military uniforms were distributed throughout occupied Europe to demonstrate German determination and to intimidate resistance movements. The propaganda value of child soldiers was as important to the Nazi regime as their military effectiveness. The technological innovations required to support German child soldier programs drove advances in materials science, ergonomic design, and manufacturing techniques that influenced post-war industrial development. American industrial specialists found that German research into child-specific military equipment had produced innovations that had civilian applications in the post-war period. Dr. William Anderson, an industrial engineer who studied German manufacturing techniques, found significant technological innovations. The German requirement to create military equipment suitable for children drove innovations in lightweight materials, ergonomic design, and manufacturing efficiency, Dr. Anderson reported. These innovations had significant applications in post-war consumer products, particularly in areas where weight reduction and ease of use were important factors. The German child soldier program inadvertently advanced several areas of industrial technology. The psychological impact of German child soldier programs on American society was significant and long-lasting. The revelation that Nazi Germany had systematically militarized children challenged American assumptions about childhood, education, and the protection of minors. American parents and educators were forced to confront the possibility that children could be transformed into effective soldiers through systematic conditioning. Dr. Sarah Miller, a child psychologist who studied American reactions to German child soldiers, found widespread psychological distress. Americans were profoundly disturbed by the evidence of German child soldier programs, Dr. Miller reported. The idea that children could be turned into killers challenged fundamental American beliefs about childhood innocence and the role of education in society. Many Americans became concerned about the potential for similar programs to be implemented in the United States, leading to increased vigilance about protecting children from military exploitation. The documentation efforts undertaken by American forces to record German child soldier programs created an invaluable historical archive that continues to inform military and humanitarian policy today. The comprehensive nature of American documentation efforts ensured that the full scope of German child soldier programs would be preserved for future study and legal proceedings. Colonel Patricia Williams, who supervised documentation efforts, recognized the historical importance of their work. "We were documenting a unique historical phenomenon that needed to be preserved for posterity," Williams reported. The German child soldier program represented an unprecedented attempt to militarize an entire generation of children. Our documentation efforts created a comprehensive record that would serve as evidence in legal proceedings and as a warning for future generations about the dangers of child militarization. The international implications of German child soldier programs extended far beyond World War II and influenced the development of international humanitarian law for decades. The systematic use of children in combat by Nazi Germany demonstrated the need for specific legal protections for children in armed conflict and led to the development of international treaties and conventions protecting children's rights. Ambassador Charles Wilson, who served on post-war international commissions, recognized the global significance of German child soldier programs. The German systematic use of children as soldiers represented a fundamental violation of human rights that required international legal response, Wilson reported. Our documentation of these programs provided the foundation for international laws protecting children in armed conflict that continue to be relevant today. The German child soldier program demonstrated the need for permanent international monitoring and protection of children's rights in conflict situations. The educational legacy of German child soldier programs influenced American educational policy and military training for decades after World War II. The effectiveness of German child military training programs forced American educators and military leaders to reconsider their approaches to physical education, citizenship training, and military preparation. Dr. Helen Carter, who studied German educational methods, found valuable lessons for American education. The German child soldier program demonstrated the power of systematic, intensive training to develop physical and mental capabilities, Dr. Carter reported. While we rejected the ideological content and military focus of German programs, we recognized that their training methods could be adapted for positive civilian purposes. Many post-war American educational and athletic programs incorporated training techniques that had been developed for German child soldiers. The psychological research generated by studying German child soldiers advanced American understanding of child development, learning theory, and psychological conditioning. The systematic nature of German child conditioning programs provided unique insights into human psychological development that influenced American research in psychology, education, and military training. Dr. James Harrison, who studied the psychological aspects of German child soldier programs, made significant research discoveries. The German child soldier program provided unprecedented data on the effects of systematic psychological conditioning on human development, Dr. Harrison reported. While the purposes of German conditioning were morally reprehensible, the psychological techniques they developed advanced our understanding of learning, memory, and behavioral modification. This knowledge proved valuable in developing positive educational and therapeutic techniques in the post-war period. The economic impact of German child soldier programs on post-war reconstruction was significant and complex. The resources devoted to child militarization had deprived German society of normal educational and youth development programs, creating long-term deficits in human capital that complicated post-war recovery efforts. Major Robert Davis, who analyzed the economic aspects of German child soldier programs, found extensive economic damage. The German investment in child soldier programs represented a massive misallocation of resources that had serious long-term economic consequences, Davis reported. Children who should have been receiving education and training for civilian careers had instead been prepared only for military service. This created a generation of young Germans who lacked the skills necessary for post-war economic reconstruction, prolonging the recovery period and requiring extensive Allied assistance to rebuild German human capital. The medical research conducted on German child soldiers provided valuable insights into the effects of intensive physical training on developing bodies and minds. American military medical personnel found that German research had generated significant data on child physical development, stress responses, and psychological conditioning that had applications in both military and civilian contexts. Major Patricia Jones, who studied German medical research on child soldiers, found significant scientific value despite moral concerns. The German medical data on child soldiers provided unique insights into human physical and psychological development under extreme conditions, Jones reported. While the ethical implications of German research were deeply troubling, the scientific knowledge generated proved valuable for understanding child development, designing training programs, and treating stress-related disorders. This knowledge contributed to advances in pediatric medicine, sports medicine, and psychological therapy in the post-war period. The international legal precedents established through the prosecution of German child soldier programs influenced humanitarian law for decades and continue to inform international efforts to protect children in armed conflict. The American documentation and prosecution efforts created legal frameworks that serve as the foundation for modern international law regarding children and warfare. Colonel James Wilson, who worked on legal aspects of child soldier cases, established important precedents. The prosecution of German child soldier programs created the legal foundation for international laws protecting children in armed conflict, Wilson reported. Our legal work established precedents regarding the recruitment, training, and use of children in military contexts that continue to influence international humanitarian law today. The German child soldier cases demonstrated the need for permanent international legal protections for children in conflict situations. The cultural impact of German child soldier programs on American society was profound and lasting, challenging fundamental assumptions about childhood, education, and the role of government in family life. The revelation that an advanced society could systematically militarize children forced Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about the protection of children and the limits of governmental authority. Dr. Margaret Thompson, who studied American cultural responses to German child soldiers, found significant social changes. The discovery of German child soldier programs fundamentally changed American attitudes toward childhood and education, Thompson reported. Americans became more aware of the vulnerability of children to governmental manipulation and more protective of children's rights to normal development. This led to increased emphasis on protecting children from political indoctrination and military exploitation, influencing American educational policy and family law for decades. The strategic implications of German child soldier programs influenced American military planning and national security policy throughout the Cold War period. The effectiveness of German child soldiers in combat demonstrated that traditional assumptions about military personnel requirements needed to be reconsidered in the context of total war and systematic indoctrination. General Omar Bradley, who commanded American forces that encountered German child soldiers, incorporated these lessons into post-war military planning. The German child soldier program demonstrated that any population could be militarized given sufficient time, resources, and systematic indoctrination, Bradley reported. This influenced our assessment of potential future threats and our approach to military planning. We had to consider the possibility that future adversaries might attempt to replicate German child soldier programs, requiring us to develop appropriate countermeasures and rules of engagement. The technological intelligence gathered from German child soldier equipment influenced American weapons development and military technology research for decades. The innovative design solutions developed by Germans for child-specific military equipment provided valuable insights for creating more effective and user-friendly military technology. Colonel James Wright, who analyzed German child soldier technology, found significant military applications. The German innovations in lightweight, simplified military equipment had important applications for American military technology development, Wright reported. Their design solutions for reducing weight and complexity while maintaining effectiveness influenced our development of equipment for paratroopers, special operations forces, and other units where weight and simplicity were critical factors. The German child soldier technology program inadvertently advanced several areas of military engineering. The human intelligence value of former German child soldiers continued to provide valuable information for American intelligence services for years after the war's end. The extensive knowledge and experience of former child soldiers made them valuable sources of information about German military capabilities, tactics, and planning methods. Captain Stephen Clark, who worked with former German child soldiers as intelligence sources, found them uniquely valuable. Former German child soldiers possessed detailed knowledge of German military systems that adult soldiers often lacked, Clark reported. Their extensive training and access to military information made them excellent sources for understanding German military doctrine, technology, and planning methods. Many former child soldiers continued to provide valuable intelligence information for years after the war, helping us understand German military capabilities and prepare for potential future conflicts. As American forces processed thousands of captured German child soldiers in the final months of World War II, they encountered a phenomenon that challenged every assumption about childhood, warfare, and human nature. These children, some as young as 8 years old, had been systematically transformed from innocent civilians into dedicated military personnel capable of operating complex weapons and fighting with suicidal determination. The discovery of German child soldiers forced American military personnel, government officials, and civilian society to confront uncomfortable truths about the malleability of human nature and the vulnerability of children to systematic conditioning. The comprehensive documentation of German child soldier programs undertaken by American forces created an invaluable historical record that continues to inform humanitarian policy, military doctrine, and international law today. The systematic nature of German child militarization programs demonstrated the importance of protecting children from exploitation and the need for permanent vigilance against the militarization of childhood. The American experience with German child soldiers during World War II served as a warning about the potential for systematic indoctrination to transform children into instruments of warfare. The effectiveness of German child soldiers challenged traditional assumptions about age, training, and military effectiveness while simultaneously demonstrating the moral imperative to protect children from military exploitation. The legacy of American encounters with German child soldiers extends far beyond the historical documentation of a specific wartime phenomenon. The comprehensive American response to German child soldier programs, including documentation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and policy development, established precedents and frameworks that continue to influence international efforts to protect children in conflict situations around the world. The courage and professionalism demonstrated by American military personnel in dealing with the complex moral and practical challenges posed by German child soldiers reflected the highest traditions of military service and humanitarian responsibility. Their efforts to document, understand, and respond appropriately to German child soldier programs created a foundation for protecting children in future conflicts and ensuring that the systematic militarization of children would never again be allowed to occur without international intervention and accountability. Today, as conflicts around the world continue to threaten children and military organizations seek to exploit vulnerable populations, the American experience with German child soldiers during World War II serves as both a warning and a guide. The comprehensive documentation undertaken by American forces provides a detailed blueprint for identifying, documenting, and responding to child soldier programs while protecting the rights and welfare of child victims. The systematic transformation of German children into soldiers during World War II represents one of the most disturbing examples of child exploitation in modern history. The American discovery and documentation of these programs ensured that this historical atrocity would not be forgotten and that future generations would understand the importance of protecting children from military exploitation. The legacy of American encounters with German child soldiers continues to influence humanitarian policy, international law, and military doctrine, serving as a permanent reminder of the vulnerability of children and the responsibility of civilized societies to protect them from exploitation and abuse.